Now, I want to acknowledge up front that there are probably several people in the comments section of this video informing me that the title of this video is nothing but ludicrous internet clickbait. And my response to that is, I'm sorry your words have no effect. I already burned a legendary resistance. Today, I want to talk about why I think legendary resistances in D&D 5e are an example of bad game design on this episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello travelers and tourists, my name is Mark and I am the Local Disaster Tour Guide. That's right, I am a storyteller who surprisingly has limits on the kinds of torture that I will inflict upon my players. Who knew? Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder, Starfinder, and today D&D 5e, where I want to do a little bit of an opinion piece video. I had this weird gap in my schedule where I wasn't sure what I wanted to talk about, but recently I saw an episode of Critical Role and it reminded me of one of the elements of D&D 5e that, honestly, I don't like, and that is legendary resistances. So today, I want to talk about why legendary resistances are part of D&D 5e. I want to talk about why I think they are an example of bad game design, and I want to compare them to some of the other things that D&D 5e does, as well as some of the things Pathfinder 2e does, that show how you can solve those kinds of problems in a better way. But before I get into all of that, don't forget to do all of the YouTube stuff. If you enjoy this video, please like it and share it. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and you can check out my free Discord as well as my Patreon page, both of which are linked in the video description. However, as always, the best thing that you can do is jump down into the comments section and leave your thoughts on this topic. Yes, I know that this is an opinion piece, and yes, I know that I run the risk of fueling some internet outrage, but to be honest, it's always interesting to hear what you all have to say, to get your feedback and your thoughts and your take on these particular topics, so I look forward to what you have to say, and I have enough experience with this community to know you all are going to handle this conversation well. But let's get into the conversation and allow me to set the stage with a recent episode of Critical Role that I was able to watch. Now, really quick, there will be some extremely mild spoilers for Critical Role Campaign 3, Episode 33 in this video. And when I say mild spoilers, I mean, if you've been on YouTube in the last 3 weeks, you've probably already had some of this spoiled just by seeing video titles pop up. So I don't think anything I'm going to say here is going to be super spoilery for that episode, but do be cautious. I'm going to try to avoid saying anything too far. In reality, Critical Role just kind of inspired this conversation, and that's ultimately just a tangent of what I think is the major conversation. In Critical Role Campaign 3, Episode 33, the group goes up against a pretty major boss fight. Now, I want to say really quick, this is not a criticism of Matthew Mercer or any of the people who play with him. To be honest, I think Mercer spins a very good story, and the actors on that show do a good job of portraying their characters and portraying them very well. The episode was, for the most part, enjoyable to watch, but when I was watching Episode 33, I didn't enjoy the boss fight. The storytelling was good, the acting was good, the staging for that show was absolutely amazing, but on several occasions, I found myself very disappointed by the actual boss fight that they were portraying in that particular episode. And to be honest, one of the big reasons I really disliked that episode was because of legendary resistances. This is a mechanic that exists in D&D 5e where a boss creature, if it fails a saving throw, can, on 3 different occasions, just decide that they succeeded on the saving throw instead and essentially shrug off any negative effects of whatever spell or attack that they just got hit with. It should be no surprise that this happened 3 different times in Mercer's boss fight for his gaming group, and every time it happened, it just destroyed the story for me. It was like the story ran into a brick wall, and the reality is, every time I have encountered legendary resistances in D&D 5e, they've always done that to me. Every time I see this mechanic, I hate it. And I feel like it ruins stories and it ruins games, and it is representative of what might be the worst fix to a real problem I have seen in at least modern RPG game design. So let me back up a step or two and broaden the conversation a little bit. Longtime fans of this channel know that D&D 5e is not my primary game. This is pretty much a Pathfinder channel, and I think if you've seen a lot of my videos, you know that. I will occasionally talk about D&D 5e on this channel, and if you want to see a video where I really talk about why I don't invest in D&D 5e, you'll find a link to that up here. Overall, it's pretty easy to say that while I enjoy D&D 5e, it occupies a niche in the gaming space that just isn't something I want to invest in. It doesn't really meet a need that I have at my gaming table. But still, overall, when I do play D&D 5e, I typically enjoy it. There aren't a ton of mechanics in D&D 5e that I just consider to be bad mechanics, but Legendary Resistances is a very obvious exception to that statement, because Legendary Resistances really, to me, fly in the face of what a TTRPG should be and how I think a TTRPG should be managed. However, I do realize that Legendary Resistances exist in D&D 5e for a reason. And that reason is, very simply, D&D 5e is just trying to make their boss fights better. They want to make it more interesting, they want to make it more tense, and they want to set up boss fights in such a way that a dungeon master can throw a single major foe against a party and that foe be a reasonable threat. This is an issue that I think every storyteller in every TTRPG under the sun understands. I remember several years ago I was running the longest Pathfinder 1st Edition campaign that I ever ran. And when my players finally got to the last boss of the entire campaign, a villain that I had been building up for literal years, my party fighter managed to mythic charge and legitimately roll 4 critical hits in a single round, functionally killing that boss in less than a single turn. I think every storyteller has been there. You had a serious threat that you wanted your party to really enjoy fighting, and your party just cleans it up in seconds. This happens in gaming a lot, and in D&D 5e, Wizards of the Coast introduced some rules that tried to address this idea of one-turn kills on major baddies. Now, I don't want to dive into the whole of D&D 5e, but just to give us some points of comparison, D&D 5e has 3 different things that game masters can do to help make boss fights more interesting. The first one is the Lair Action, the second option is Legendary Actions, and the third option is Legendary Resistances. And taking a look at these 3, I really like Lair Actions. I'm conflicted on Legendary Actions, and I just don't like Legendary Resistances. So let's examine them. First up, Lair Actions. Once every turn as you go through the initiative count, the boss is able to use their environment in some dramatic way to harm or hinder the player characters. Now, one of the oldest pieces of storytelling advice is to set your battles in interesting environments, and the idea of timed threats that your PCs have to dodge while they're trying to deal with a particular foe, that's just classic good storytelling. And so Wizards of the Coast putting the Lair action in as a specific option for boss fights just kind of fits well with storytelling as a whole, and generally I think is a good idea. When Wizards of the Coast was trying to make boss fights better in D&D 5e, the Lair action is a good inclusion. The next option is a little bit iffier for me. It's the legendary actions that boss creatures can use in D&D 5e. Essentially, it's a way to give bosses some extra actions throughout the turn, and they don't stack all of the extra actions just on top of the boss's normal turn, but rather they're split up and they occur in between actions of different PCs. And to be honest, haste is a classic effect. The idea of a particularly skilled or dangerous creature maybe moving faster or maybe having access to some kind of power that it can use more often, that can fit narratively in a lot of stories. So the concept of legendary actions in and of themselves is not necessarily bad game design, though I will say I have seen a lot of D&D 5e boss fights where the tactical advantage of those extra actions in terms of positioning, in terms of escaping threats, or in terms of initiating new threats, just doesn't feel balanced. Legendary actions are a decent concept, but the execution doesn't always feel equitable to me, and there have been a lot of occasions where I've really had a problem with that rule set. But the final option that Wizards of the Coast gives storytellers is legendary resistances, and I will just be plain, I hate legendary resistances. I consider this to be the worst fix to the instant kill boss problem that Wizards of the Coast could have possibly given us, and I have several reasons for feeling this way. First and most importantly, I want to say the one-turn kill on the big bad evil guy of your campaign is ultimately not a problem. Okay, let me put this out there. This is a big part of my storytelling philosophy. This is a big part of how I approach games. At the end of the day, the default assumption of any TTRPG, be it Pathfinder, be it Dungeons and Dragons, Star Wars, even games like Call of Cthulhu, the general assumption is you want your players to win. Yes, you want there to be some struggle. Yes, you want there to be some challenge. You want them to earn the win. But at the end of the day, assuming the dice rolls are not just catastrophic, or your players just don't do something so dumb that the damage is irreversible, the general idea is, in a TTRPG, your players are going to win. So, a one-turn kill on a big bad evil guy may be happening sooner than you planned on it happening, but it's what you expected to happen. You expected your players to win, and be it good dice rolls or good planning, if your players get the win sooner than expected, yay, the game went better than you planned. There is an extreme of this problem that you clearly want to avoid, which is you don't want fights to lose their threat. You want your players to have a genuine sense of danger to the game, and so if combat has no teeth, then yeah, that's a problem. But the individual instance of a boss just dropping too quickly is not in and of itself a bad thing, and that's part of the reason that 5e's solutions to this problem give me serious concerns. It's that 5e is trying to solve something that is not in and of itself a problem. Yes, you hope the big bad evil guy gives your players a truly epic fight, but if they go down fast, hey, congratulate your players for a job well done. But I think the issues with legendary resistances in particular go a little bit deeper, and part of it is the age-old question of Game Master fudging. Should Game Masters fudge dice rolls? Now, in full transparency, I have openly said on this channel that I do occasionally fudge dice as a game master, and I even tell my players exactly when and exactly how I will fudge dice rolls in a particular game. And if you want to see that full conversation, there's a video on that as well. But I am in the camp that says that occasionally fudging dice rolls is a good thing. However, Legendary Resistances, at least in my mind, is the #1 example of why people should be mad at a game master fudging dice rolls. Because the game master gets to look at a player and say, completely arbitrarily, no, you failed. In the episode of Critical Role that I saw, there was one particular moment where one of the players ran into a legendary resistance. They thought that they had pitched a spell that was going to be very impactful. The villain had failed their saving throw, but then Matthew Mercer surprised them with, oh wait, there's another legendary resistance, and the look of frustration on that player's face was something I understood on a very visceral level. I don't like the idea of a game master being able to look at a player and say, I've decided what you did just didn't work because I don't like the outcome. Legendary Resistances are game master fudging of dice rolls specifically in opposition to the players. Maybe you've seen on other channels the idea of player versus game master mentality, and Legendary Resistances are basically a toxic mixture of game master fudging and GM versus PC mentality in a single mechanic that I just don't like. This is a side point that I could spend way too much time on, so I'm going to try to keep this super brief. My philosophy on game master fudging of dice rolls is explicitly and specifically pro-player. And I'm not going to dive into exactly what that means, but essentially I have a contract with my players about modifying dice rolls in a way that I feel improves the game for my players. It is explicitly done because I want my players to enjoy the game. And so for me, Legendary Resistances, while it is GM fudging, which is something that I do, is something that I find frustrating because where I will modify dice rolls because I want my players to have a better experience, Legendary Resistances explicitly makes the experience worse for players. And I think the experience of that one player on Critical Role is a good example of why my complaints about Legendary Resistances are so important. The battle had been going badly for the players in the game. And that player had thrown out a spell, and the villain failed their saving throw, and for a brief moment it looked like the players might have a chance to turn the tide of the battle, maybe escape the battle, or maybe just buy a few moments to breathe. That player had done something that was going to be very helpful to their team, and then the game master said, no. And again, I don't fault Matthew Mercer here, he was just using the rules of the game as written, but it broke the immersion in the story for me, and I imagine for that player and for a lot of people watching. Legendary Resistances ultimately take agency away from players inside of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, and I think that that is bad game design. Think about the other two options that Wizards gives game masters to help make bosses more intense: Lair Actions and Legendary Actions. I really like Lair Actions, and Legendary Actions I may think are troubled, but at least the concept is good as far as I'm concerned. Both of those things make the boss more dangerous. And that's positive. That doesn't, at least at face value, hinder the players in any way, it just ramps up the tension. Legendary Resistances explicitly exist to take agency and actions away from the player, and, particularly troubling in my mind, the Game Master gets to use the Legendary Resistance after the boss fails their save. So the player gets to know the thrill of doing something, and then the Game Master just comes in and tears it away from them. That to me is bad storytelling, and I just think that legendary resistances will universally wreck, at least for a moment, any story that they are used in. But this video is not going to do any good if all I do is sit around and complain about legendary resistances. Whether you agree with my complaints or not, it is worthwhile to ask the question, is there a better way to fix the problem that legendary resistances are trying to solve? And I think the answer is yes. Now, first and foremost, D&D 5e has given us two reasonable solutions to the problem of easy boss deaths already in the form of lair actions and legendary actions. I think that that is part of the conversation if you want to go that route, but I think it is worthwhile to step back a little bit and ask how this idea of the one-round KO of the BBEG even became part of the TTRPG sphere. Now, this is a conversation that could get very complex very quickly, but I think that there are a couple of easy points here. Number one is the balance of the math inside of the TTRPG, and number two is the balancing of the action economy inside of a TTRPG. Generally speaking, I think if a BBEG goes down too fast or too easy, it is probably because either the math of the TTRPG is off in some fashion, or the action economy is just tilted too far in favor of the players, and that ultimately does the BBEG in. I have seen plenty of my boss monsters go down in 1 or 2 rounds because there were just too many players who could dish out too much damage or too many spells, and the monster just faltered way too fast. I guess it makes sense that numbers are an advantage in a battle. This may be hard to hear, but right now 1D&D is doing the playtest for the next iteration of what Dungeons & Dragons is going to look like, so maybe it's worth saying the fact that D&D 5e needs lair actions, legendary actions, and the abysmal legendary resistances to balance their boss monsters should tell us that the math or action economy of the game isn't working. And hopefully Wizards of the Coast can look at the math, look at the action economy, and find a way to bring those things back into a better balance where extreme fixes like this aren't even necessary to begin with. In fact, if you compare Pathfinder 2nd Edition to D&D 5e, one of the things you will hear a lot of people say about Pathfinder 2e is the math is tight. In some cases, the math is too tight. One of my earliest mistakes as a storyteller in Pathfinder 2e is I didn't expect the severe encounter inside of the game to actually be a severe fight in terms of how difficult of a time my party was going to have. When Paizo worked out the numbers for their game, they made those numbers tight and they made those numbers land, for the most part, exactly where they wanted them to land. And so one of the things that any game, D&D 5e, Pathfinder 2e, or other systems out there, one of the things they can do to avoid the insta-kill BBEG is just to make sure that the numbers of the game are tighter where those extreme swings don't happen, or at least don't happen nearly as often. However, there's another thing that Pathfinder 2e does that helps to address this problem that I also think is worth stopping to consider, and that is the unique interaction between Pathfinder 2e's 4 degrees of success and a trait called incapacitation. Now, Pathfinder 2e uses 4 degrees of success, and these 4 degrees of success have existed in other TTRPGs well before 2e came onto the scene, but Pathfinder 2e did a really good job of codifying what it means that anytime you roll a dice, you can have a critical success, a regular failure, or a critical failure. Now, not every action or spell necessarily has all 4 outcomes, but for most of the things inside the game, anytime a dice is rolled, you can get one of those 4 outcomes. There's going to be something attached to each of those particular statements. This is important because it helps avoid a problem that exists in a lot of RPGs especially with spellcasting, it's a little thing that some gamers call save or suck. Basically, what that means is, when a wizard casts a spell, if the monster makes the save, they're perfectly fine. If the monster fails their save, well, it sucks to be that monster because the fight is now pretty much over. Not every single spell obviously had this particular moniker, but it was common enough that a lot of players referred to this problem. Spellcasting was just extremely swingy. Dice rolls could make it completely useless or completely overpowered, and there wasn't much in between. Pathfinder 2e does a pretty good job of giving several spaces along this scale where very extreme dice rolls can still have that full save or suck outcome, but then for a large space in between, there are a scale of outcomes that still penalize the monster, still affect the battlefield, but don't have the drastic effects that older spellcasting used to have. One of the things Pathfinder 2e did to fix the math problem on balancing a BBEG against a party is just to give most actions, most spells, these 4 degrees of success, a larger variety of outcomes, and just spreading those outcomes out and making a better bell curve goes a long way to making that math balance in the way you want it to. Then you combine this with incapacitation. Pathfinder 2e does have 1-turn KO spells. There are spells that can kill an opponent in a single casting. With 1 attack roll, with 1 saving throw, someone can drop. And here's the thing, most of those spells come with the incapacitation trait. And essentially, when you see that trait, incapacitation, what it means is, when you use this particular spell, attack, ability, whatever, against a higher level target, the outcome is 1 degree less severe for that target. A critical success becomes a success becomes a failure becomes a critical failure. Most of the spells that have the potential to 1-turn KO a target require what would essentially be a critical success for your player character. Obviously, depending on saves versus attack rolls, the exact roll will change, but hopefully you understand the comparison I'm making. If critical success is the only outcome that 1 turn incapacitates the target, then automatically knocking a higher level target down 1 degree prevents that 1-turn KO from even occurring in the first place. This has several important benefits. For storytellers, you don't have to worry about your players one-shotting your BBEG. The fight's probably going to go about the length of time you want it to go, but for players this has several important effects as well. Number 1, it allows 1-turn KO spells to remain in the game without them becoming just auto win buttons. Against higher level targets, the 1-turn KO spells are not going to be as effective, but against lower level targets you can use them rather indiscriminately, and with the way Paizo's math works, that indiscriminate use actually becomes kind of fun and over the top. If you understand level and proficiency and how that math scales, you know why I'm laughing right now. Players still get to use incapacitation effects, and they even have targets where those effects are more useful, but on top of that, if a player uses these particularly powerful spells against a higher level target, there is still a reasonable chance something happens. You see, that's one of the other big benefits of the 4 degrees of success that I talked about earlier. The extremes of nothing or in the fight exist all the way over at critical success and critical failure. But in the middle ground, you are still impacting the battle. You're still dealing some damage to the target, you are probably inflicting some kind of penalty for a round or two that the target has to deal with. A player that uses an incapacitation spell against a higher level target, sure, they're probably not going to instantly KO the target, but there is a very good chance they are going to do something to the target, and that something could be the little bit of influence necessary to push the battle in the direction that the player characters want it to go. Legendary resistances and incapacitation both exist as a way to help storytellers protect their villains, but the legendary resistance just shuts the player down with no hope for recovery, while incapacitation still allows the player to have some autonomy, to have some influence on that turn and that battle, while keeping the math and the action economy more in check. But those are just my thoughts on legendary resistances in D&D 5e. This is one of the few mechanics in D&D 5e that I just truly consider to be a bad mechanic. Yes, I understand the problem that Wizards of the Coast was trying to solve, but at the end of the day, I don't think legendary resistances solve the problem. I think they actually make it worse. But let me turn the conversation over to you. What are your thoughts on legendary resistances, and what are your thoughts on different ways that gaming companies might deal with this issue of fragile or easily defeated villains in a story? Jump down into the comments section and let me know what your thoughts are, or any particularly good examples that you've seen. And of course, don't forget to do all of that other YouTube stuff. Like the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, check out Discord, Patreon, all that good stuff. Definitely let me know if you enjoyed this more opinion-oriented style of video. But thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being part of the conversation. Have a wonderful day.